Hi everyone, welcome back. In the last lecture, I talked about the concepts of retribution and deterrence in the context of a perfectly operating exchange system. What I'd like to do now is to transfer some of those arguments and concepts from the system of competitive exchange to the system of tort liability in order to lay the groundwork for a further discussion of criminal liability. As we extend the discussion of retribution and deterrence in this way, we'll be drawing on a style of thinking that is central to the work of the economist Oliver Williamson, who's pictured here. Williamson was one of my own teachers when I was in graduate school, and the project of his entire scholarly career can be summarized as I've summarized it on the slide. Williamson tries to match different kinds of transactions which differ in their attributes. That is, some transactions have certain kinds of recurrence, some transactions are between certain kinds of individuals, some transactions are conducted in a context where there are large numbers of people on either side of the transaction, and so on. So every transaction is different, every transaction has different attributes, and Williamson's project is to match transactions which differ in their attributes, to governance structures, which differ in their capabilities. Governance structures are, broadly speaking, the way in which we organize particular kinds of activity. So, transactions, as we've seen, can be organized in certain circumstances in competitive exchange systems. They can be organized in other circumstances in liability systems. So liability systems and exchange systems are different ways to organize or govern different kinds of transactions. So again, Williamson's project is to match transactions which differ in their attributes to governance structures which differ in their capabilities so as to minimize the costs of transacting and thus facilitate as many transactions as possible. Actually, we've been doing this for quite a few lectures now. And with Calabrese and Melamed, this perspective of alternative governance structures is exactly the way that we've understood the system of tort liability. When transactions costs are low, as they are in the case of the ordinary inputs in our steel plant example, and thus conditions are favorable to exchange, then entitlements can be adequately protected by property rules, which means that no entitlement will be taken without that entitlement owner's consent, and as a result, only efficient cost imposition is undertaken. Notice that in this case, there won't be any uncompensated cost imposition because conditions are favorable to exchange and because owners of entitlements can prevent cost imposition from taking place without their consent simply by refusing to surrender their entitlement. Where they have the ability to refuse to surrender their entitlement in this way, property rules are generally adequate to protect their entitlements, and free exchange will operate to allocate entitlements to their highest valuing owners. On the other hand, when transactions costs are high, as they are in the case of the good health input in our steel plant example, then conditions are unfavorable to exchange, and entitlements must be protected not through property rules and free exchange, but through liability rules and a costly, imperfect legal system that attempts to estimate the economic value of the involuntary, uncompensated cost imposition, and then to force the imposer of those costs to pay that sum to the person who has borne the cost. That is, to mimic what would happen if transactions costs were low and an actual exchange were taking place between the cost imposer and the cost bearer. The liability system, as I've suggested, completes the transaction that was broken in time by the cost imposer's initial seizure of the cost bearer's entitlement, and the liability system, the liability proceeding, completes that transaction by forcing the cost imposer to pay for that entitlement to the cost bearer directly. And if the system works perfectly, the liability system works perfectly, then just like the exchange system, the liability system will distinguish efficient from inefficient torts and effectively encourage efficient torts and discouraging only the latter torts. Again, because if a tort is efficient, then committing the tort is worth more to the person who imposes the costs than the costs are worth to the person who bears them. So if the person who commits the tort then does so, and then pays the cost bearer the full costs that the tort has imposed, then the cost imposer has some value left over, and it's that value left over that identifies the transaction as being efficient. The sum total of economic value after the tort is greater than the sum total of economic value before the tort, much as the sum total of the values of the two houses in our Hamilton and Jefferson example is maximized when the sirens are being tested and not when they're not being tested. We can illustrate this idea with a very famous case, at least famous amongst the scholars of law and economics, called Boomer versus Atlantic Cement Company, a case decided in 1970 in the court system of New York State. The cement company, the Atlantic Cement Company, had a large plant that made cement. Here's a picture of a similar plant. As you can see, tires are being fed into a kiln in order to help with the production of cement. The cement company had a plant that was located in an area where there were not very many neighbors, but there were enough neighbors to bear some costs as a result of pollution and other kinds of damage that was done to their property by the operation of the cement plant. Since there were not many such neighbors bearing the costs, the case was resolved with an individual tort suit between Boomer, one of the neighbors who had suffered cost at the hands of the cement company, and the cement company itself. Boomer asked the court to make the cement company stop making cement and therefore stop producing the cost on Boomer's property that had motivated the lawsuit. But it became clear over the course of the lawsuit that the right to make that cement and thus to produce the external costs borne by Boomer was worth significantly more to the cement company than it was to Boomer. And so, as a result, if the court were to grant Boomer's wish and stop the cement company from making their cement, the cost to the cement company would be much greater than the savings to Boomer, and thus stopping the production of the cement would be an inefficient resolution of the problem. And so the court hit upon an interesting solution. It said that the cement company can continue to produce the cement and continue to commit the tort of unlawfully seizing Boomer's entitlement to be free from the costs of pollution, as long as the plant continued to pay permanent damages to Boomer. This means that the plant will simply treat that payment as a kind of cost of business, just the price of purchasing another necessary input. To make cement, you have to buy labor, land, raw materials, and the destruction to Boomer's property. But now the court has given the cement company a way to purchase that last input, that is the damage to Boomer's property, in the same way that it purchases all of the other inputs, that is by making a steady stream of payments over time to continuously compensate Boomer for the input that he is contributing to the production of cement. This is obviously an efficient tort. The cement company continues to unlawfully take the entitlement owned by Boomer. Every day that it produces cement, it takes the entitlement of Boomer, and every day it pays for that entitlement by paying the damages that were specified by the court. Obviously, the cement company can continue to make cement at a profit if it pays this damages, and so the tort in this case is efficient. the entitlement to be free of the costs of cement making that Boomer originally began with is placed in the higher valuing owner when the cement company has it than when Boomer has it, and the court in this case enables the cement company to continuously, each and every day, purchase the relevant entitlement from Boomer. And as you can see, this tort is not deterred by the requirement that the plant pay retribution to Boomer for the costs that he has borne. So let's look a little bit more closely at the nature of torts. What kind of transaction occurs when a tort is committed? Who takes what from whom? Well, part of the answer we've already seen. A tort occurs, in these examples, when the steel or cement plant unlawfully takes entitlements to be free of these costs of pollution or costs to their good health, when the plant unlawfully takes entitlements from its neighbors without their consent and without compensation to them for the costs that they've borne. The act of seizing the entitlement is in fact the tort. Now, where the parties are few and easy to identify, that is, where there's only one cost imposer, and where, as in the Boomer case, the costs are imposed on one or a very small number of individuals, then individual tort suits are appropriate, and these are in fact the vast majority of tort suits in practice. And in these tort suits, as we've seen, the liability system attempts to approximate the results of exchange by requiring that cost imposers, once it's been adjudicated that they have in fact committed a tort against this particular plaintiff, to pay compensatory damages that are limited to the market value of the lost entitlements, including the market value of such things as good health, with occasional bonuses, as we've said, for what the law calls pain and suffering. You'll notice here I've highlighted the word approximate in the sentence that individual tort suits approximate exchange by requiring compensatory damages. These payments are approximations rather than exact compensation for two clear reasons. One of them is that the market value represents the value to replace a particular object. So if I drive my car carelessly into your fence and destroy it, and the fence is worth $100, and you sue me for that cost, the jury will almost certainly, if I'm found liable for the tort, assess damages of $100 to me. That allows you to go off to the store and buy another fence, much like the one that I've just described, at the price of $100. But it's not the same fence, and you'll notice you didn't destroy your fence voluntarily and replace it with the $100 fence that you've now had to replace it with as a result of the accident. So the value that you actually placed on the first fence, the one that was destroyed, is a little more, possibly much more than $100, depending on whether it has any sentimental value to you. Because if it were only $100 or less than $100, you'd already have sold the fence or destroyed it and replaced it with a fence that cost $100. Because you haven't done that, it seems clear that the fence, before it was destroyed, was worth more than $100 to you. So if I destroy it and you're paid only $100, then the market value will systematically undercompensate you for the costs that you have actually suffered. And related to that is what I've earlier called sentimental value. We needn't have sentimental value for the first point to be true. If I simply value the fence for whatever reason at more than $100, then a $100 payment will undervalue my value and won't fully compensate me. But if I'm not paid for pain and suffering or for sentimental value, then some of the costs that I actually do incur from losing the fence might not be compensated at all because there are no market values for the things that I've lost. So, for example, I might be terrified by having lost my fence to your car. I might be traumatized. I might suffer psychic damage in some way. Certainly, this happens to people who have been victims of accidents of a more serious kind. But it's very difficult to quantify the value of that kind of suffering because it has no market value. You can't buy and sell objects that are suffering so that we can see exactly how much the suffering costs. The tort system, the liability system, is good at compensating for market values, but it's not good at compensating for values that can't easily be expressed in market terms, that is, can't easily be reduced to dollars and cents. And so tort suits represent an attempt to approximate what an actual exchange between a tortious cost imposer and the victim of that tort might actually be. But even in the best of circumstances, tort suits will never get it exactly right the way that free exchange can. Tort suits can only approximate with their compensatory damages the actual damages that have been suffered by the victims of torts. So, in individual tort suits, the costs are almost exclusively economic. That is, costs that can be measured in terms of market values. And these costs in individual suits are typically spread over a very few bearers. But we've also seen the class action alternative, where, as in the steel plant example, there are many bearers all suffering the same kind of economic cost in the same way at the hands of the same cost imposers. Tort suits may be litigated as class actions that amalgamate the claims of all of the many cost bearers into a single legal proceeding at which the liability of the plant of the cost imposer is established, and a single sum of damages representing the sum of all of the individual damages of members of the class are awarded as a liability price. So class action suits deal with exclusively economic costs, almost exclusively economic costs that can be reduced to market values. And in this case, these costs are spread over many cost bearers. But in either case, efficient torts are encouraged by the liability system, and costs are always measured and compensated in the tort liability system in monetary values. Again, another way of saying that torts are about economic costs. So, to summarize, the tort liability system is an imperfect, costly system to internalize the uncompensated economic costs, those that can be easily traded in markets and reduced to market values, of unlawful seizures of entitlements, and the system attempts to distinguish efficient from inefficient torts and to discourage only the latter while effectively encouraging only the former. Let's talk a little bit more about this notion of economic cost and its relation to tort. Here's a picture of the typical situation that produces a tort suit, a fender bender in urban traffic. As you can see in the traffic, one of the drivers of these two small cars has accidentally driven the car into the other car, and there's been some minor damage. The two drivers are standing nervously in the street, presumably waiting for the police to come and help clear out the accident. It's obvious, let's assume that the car on the left was driven by that woman, and let's assume that it was at fault for the accident. That is, that the woman had carelessly, in some sense, driven her car, and as a result of her carelessness, she drove the car into the left side of the gentleman's car and produced, as you can see, the damage to his fender. How much damage has been produced by this particular tort? Well, obviously, there's been some damage to the car, but the damage to the car is clearly economic. The owner of the car can take the car to a body shop, get the car fixed, be charged for it, and then we'll know what the value of that economic damage was, and it's relatively easy to assess the value of that damage to the young woman who has performed the tort and created the cost of the fender bender itself. But if we look around and ask whether there's any other sort of cost that's been imposed by the tort, it's hard to find them. It was, after all, an accident. Happily, nobody was hurt, and it's obvious that nobody intended to create this accident. And we all know that accidents happen. Accidents sometimes happen even when we're careful, but accidents frequently happen when we're careless, and most of us are careless at least some of the time, and so almost everybody is the negligent causer of an accident, at least occasionally. As a result, it's very, very hard for us to become morally outraged, if you will, at somebody's having had an accident. Well, yes, it was careless of the lady to drive the car in the way that she did, but she caused some damage and she's going to have to pay for that damage, and that seems to make the world right. There is no reason to punish her any further. She's already had to pay the costs of her carelessness in terms of the dented fender. She hasn't offended anybody's moral sense. She hasn't produced an enormous amount of pain and suffering in any other person. And very few people will look at this situation with outrage and say that it was a morally despicable thing for the woman to drive the car in the way that she did. But we might feel differently if, for example, the story were such that the woman and the man actually knew one another, that the woman had a reason to dislike the man, that she saw the man driving in his car on the street and intentionally sped up, drove her car toward his, and smashed her car into the left side of his car intentionally so as to harm the car. Notice what she's done. She's created exactly the same damage as was created in the accidental case to the other man's car. So that cost has been imposed again by this second cost-imposing activity. But now the intentionality of that act adds a new wrinkle to it. Perhaps bystanders may look at this, and they too will see something in it that makes them bear cost. Maybe they'll simply be outraged at what this woman has done. It was dangerous, it was nasty, it was uncalled for, and under the circumstances, because it created the risk of some serious injury, one might think it was morally wrong. If I'm one of those bystanders and I feel that way, and I'm outraged at the intentional infliction of an economic cost on this gentleman by this lady, then in fact I too suffer costs as a result of her act. Only these are not costs typically that are easily reduced to market values. I might not change my behavior in any particular way. I might not do anything. I might just walk away from the scene feeling much worse than I did before the accident happened because I'm so angry at what I've just seen and wish that I could wreak some vengeance on that woman for what she did to that man. So, costs are imposed by torts, but some torts may impose different kinds of costs than other torts. Remember our steel plant. Notice that it was not accidentally inflicting costs on its neighbors. It was purposely inflicting those costs, purposefully stealing those entitlements, and then simply treating the damages as if they were another cost of business, the price of another necessary input. People might be outraged by that, and perhaps that outrage can also be addressed by the liability system. We'll talk about that in the next lecture.